The frozen earth of the cemetery cracked beneath Quinlan Drake's boots as he stood before two fresh graves. His wife's name carved into weathered pine beside that of a stranger he had never met. Hangtown, California had seen a brutal winter in 1874, the kind that swept down from the Sierra Nevada and claimed lives without mercy. Sarah Drake had been caught in a blizzard while riding back from the neighboring ranch. Her horse found 3 days later, her body discovered half buried in snow just a mile from home. The same storm had taken Thomas Jensen, a merchant who had tried to deliver supplies to an isolated homestead and never made it back. The town buried them on the same gray February afternoon, the preacher's words nearly stolen by the bitter wind that still hadn't released its grip on the gold country. Quinlan had stopped listening halfway through the service. He was 28 years old and had already learned that God's plans made no sense to the living. He stood there in his worn coat, his dark hair whipping across his face, his hands clenched so tight his knuckles had gone white. Sarah had been his wife for 3 years, his sweetheart for 2 before that. They had planned to start a family come spring. Now spring would arrive without her, and Quinlan would face it alone on the cattle ranch they had built together from nothing. Across the frozen grave, partially obscured by the small gathering of mourners, stood a woman Quinlan had seen only a handful of times in town. Beatrice Jensen wore black that seemed to swallow her whole, her honey-colored hair pulled back severely from a face that might have been pretty if grief had not carved such deep lines around her eyes and mouth. She was younger than her late husband by several years, Quinlan had heard, maybe 23 or 24. Thomas Jensen had been a good man by all accounts, 15 years her senior, who had married the orphaned girl when she had nowhere else to turn. Quinlan knew nothing more about her than that. He did not approach her after the burial. He mounted his horse and rode back to his ranch, where the cattle needed feeding and the fences needed mending and life demanded to continue even when everything inside him had died in that blizzard alongside Sarah. The weeks that followed blurred together in a haze of work and whiskey. Quinlan rose before dawn, tended the cattle, repaired winter damage, and fell into bed long after dark. He spoke to no one unless necessary. The ranch hands he employed kept their distance, sensing the volatile grief that simmered beneath his silence. Spring began to show itself in tentative ways, snow melting to reveal brown grass that would soon turn green, buds appearing on the bare branches of aspens, the sun climbing higher each day and carrying genuine warmth. Quinlan hated it all. He was in Hangtown on a supply run in late March when he saw her again. Beatrice Jensen stood outside the general store, staring at a notice posted on the wooden wall. Even from a distance, Quinlan could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her gloved hands were clasped tightly together. She wore the same black dress, though the wind that tugged at her skirts was no longer cruel with winter's bite. He should have walked past. He had his own grief to manage, his own shattered life to somehow piece together. But something in her posture, a particular quality of desperation, made him pause. "Madam," he said, removing his hat. "Are you all right?" She turned, and he saw her face more clearly than he had at the funeral. Her eyes were an unusual shade of amber, red-rimmed from recent tears. There was a bruise on her wrist, just visible beneath her sleeve, that made his jaw tighten. "I am managing, Mr. Drake," she said quietly. She knew his name. Of course she did. Everyone in Hangtown knew who had lost whom that winter. "Thank you for asking." He should have nodded and moved on. Instead, he found himself looking at the notice she had been reading. It was an eviction notice, posted by the bank. Thomas Jensen's debts, it seemed, had survived him. Beatrice Jensen had 30 days to vacate the property or face forcible removal. You have nowhere to go, Quinlan said. It was not a question. Her chin lifted slightly, pride warring with desperation. I will find something. Perhaps work as a laundress or a cook. Someone will need help. They both knew how unlikely that was. Hangtown was not a large town, and winter had been hard on everyone. There were no jobs for widows with no family and no resources. Quinlan thought of the empty house on his ranch, the rooms that echoed with Sarah's absence. He thought of his wife's voice, her kindness, how she had always opened their home to those in need. I need help at the ranch, he heard himself say. Someone to manage the house, prepare meals for the hands. The pay is fair, and there is a small cabin you could use. Beatrice stared at him, her amber eyes searching his face for something he could not name. Mr. Drake, I could not possibly impose on your grief. You would not be imposing. You would be working. He was not sure why he was pressing this, only that the thought of her alone and desperate seemed to add another layer of wrong to a winter that had already taken too much. I will be honest with you, Mrs. Jensen. The main house reminds me of my wife every moment I am in it. I have been sleeping in the bunkhouse with the hands. If you were to take the cabin and manage the household, it would be a relief to me, not a burden. She looked back at the eviction notice, then at him. He saw her throat work as she swallowed. When would you need me to start? Whenever the bank takes your house, he said, or sooner if you prefer. 3 weeks later, Beatrice Jensen arrived at the Drake Ranch in a wagon borrowed from the church, carrying everything she owned in 2 small trunks and a carpetbag. Quinlan showed her to the cabin, a solid structure with a stone fireplace that he and Sarah had built for the ranch foreman before deciding they did not need one after all. He had spent the previous 2 days cleaning it out, replacing the straw mattress, making sure the chimney drew properly. The main house is unlocked, he told her, standing awkwardly in the doorway of the cabin. The kitchen is well stocked. There are 6 hands including myself, though I will be taking my meals separately. If you need anything, supplies or repairs, let me know. Thank you, Mr. Drake. Her voice was soft but steady. She stood in the middle of the cabin, still wearing her black dress, looking small and lost and trying very hard not to show it. Quinlan, he said, just Quinlan. Then you must call me Beatrice. He nodded and left her to settle in, returning to the work that never ended. But that evening, when he approached the bunkhouse, one of the hands stopped him. Boss, Mrs. Jensen has supper laid out in the main house for all of us. Says you should eat there too, at the head of the table like proper. Quinlan wanted to refuse, but he could see the other men watching him, curious and a little concerned. He had been their employer for 4 years, and they had respected Sarah. If he insulted her memory by rejecting the basic hospitality she had always insisted upon, he would lose something he could not afford to lose. So he went to the main house, his stomach tight with dread, and found the table set with Sarah's dishes, the lamps lit, the smell of beef stew and fresh bread filling the air. Beatrice stood near the stove, her hands folded in front of her, watching him with those cautious amber eyes. I hope this is acceptable, she said quietly. The other hands filed in, removing their hats, taking their seats with the awkward politeness of men unused to eating at a proper table. Quinlan sat at the head, where Sarah had always insisted he sit, and nodded to Beatrice. It is more than acceptable. Thank you. They ate in relative silence, the men uncomfortable with formal dining, Quinlan lost in memories of other meals in this room, laughter and conversation and Sarah's voice. The food was good, solidly prepared if not inspired. When the meal ended, Beatrice cleared the dishes and refused all offers of help, sending the men back to the bunkhouse and Quinlan out to wherever he chose to go. He found himself standing in the yard between the main house and the cabin, looking up at stars that seemed impossibly bright after the long winter. He heard Beatrice moving in the kitchen, the splash of water as she washed dishes. She was a stranger living in Sarah's house, using Sarah's things, and yet somehow the wrongness of it was less than the empty silence had been. Spring deepened. The grass turned green and lush, the cattle grazed contentedly, and the ranch work shifted from survival to prosperity. Quinlan still rose before dawn and worked until dark, but the sharp edge of his grief had begun to dull into something more bearable, a constant ache rather than a killing pain. He saw Beatrice daily but spoke to her rarely, just functional exchanges about supplies or repairs or messages from town. She kept the house immaculate, cooked substantial meals, and maintained a respectful distance from everyone. Quinlan noticed that she never sang while she worked, never hummed, moved through her tasks with quiet efficiency and no joy. He recognized that particular quality of grief, the way it turned life into a series of necessary actions performed without feeling. One evening in early May, he returned to the ranch later than usual after helping a neighboring rancher round up strayed cattle. The hands had already eaten and retired to the bunkhouse. Quinlan approached the main house, intending to see if there were leftovers, and found Beatrice sitting on the porch steps, her face tilted up toward the sky. She was not crying, but there was such loneliness in her posture that he nearly turned away. Instead, he sat down on the other end of the steps, leaving several feet between them. They sat in silence for a long moment, and then Beatrice spoke without looking at him. "Thomas was a good man," she said. "He married me when my parents died and I had nothing. He was kind. I wanted to love him the way a wife should love a husband, but I could not. I tried, but it was not in me. And then he died trying to help someone else, because that was who he was, and I feel guilty that I cannot grieve him the way you grieve your wife." Quinlan had not expected such honesty. He looked at her profile, the way the fading light caught in her hair, the straight line of her nose. "Sarah wanted children," he said, the words surprising him. "I kept saying we had time, that we should establish the ranch more firmly first, save more money. I thought I was being responsible. Now I realize I was just afraid, and that fear means there is nothing of her left in this world except my memories." Beatrice turned to look at him then, and something passed between them, a recognition of shared pain and shared regret. "I think," she said slowly, "that we are both haunted by different ghosts." "Yes," Quinlan agreed, "but perhaps that is better than being haunted alone." After that conversation, something shifted. They began to talk more, brief exchanges at first, then longer conversations. Quinlan learned that Beatrice had been educated by missionary teachers before her parents died, that she loved to read but had owned only 3 books, all lost when the bank claimed Thomas's house. He rode into town the next week and returned with a stack of novels from the general store, leaving them on the kitchen table without comment. Beatrice learned that Quinlan had come west from Missouri at 18, worked as a ranch hand for 6 years before buying his own land, met Sarah at a church social, and known immediately that she was the woman he would marry. She saw the way his hands gentled when he worked with the horses, the way he treated his employees with respect, the way he still avoided the bedroom he had shared with his wife. May turned to June, and the ranch thrived. Quinlan hired 2 additional hands for the summer work, and Beatrice managed the increased household without complaint. She began to plant a garden behind the house, her hands in the soil, coaxing life from the earth. Quinlan watched her from a distance one evening, kneeling among the seedlings, and felt something stir in his chest that was not quite grief. It frightened him. He began avoiding her again, taking his meals at odd hours, speaking only when necessary. Beatrice noticed but said nothing, retreating into her own careful distance. The ranch hands watched this dance with knowing eyes but kept their opinions to themselves. Then came the day in late June when raiders appeared. They were not a large group, just 4 men on tired horses, but they had guns and desperation and no compunction about taking what they wanted. Quinlan was in the north pasture when he heard the shots, 2 quick cracks that sent birds exploding from the trees. He kicked his horse into a gallop, his heart hammering, his rifle already in his hands. He crested the rise above the ranch buildings and saw the scene below. 3 of the raiders were attempting to drive off a dozen head of cattle, while the 4th remained near the main house. His gun pointed at Beatrice, who stood on the porch with her hands raised. 2 of Quinlan's hands lay motionless in the yard, and the others were nowhere to be seen. Rage and terror flooded through Quinlan in equal measure. He had lost Sarah to winter's cruelty. He would not lose Beatrice to human violence. He urged his horse down the slope, bringing his rifle up, and fired a shot over the raiders' heads. They turned, startled, and in that moment of distraction, Beatrice threw herself sideways off the porch. What followed was chaos. The raider near the house fired at Quinlan and missed. Quinlan returned fire and did not miss. The man dropped, and the others abandoned the cattle, spurring their horses toward escape. Quinlan let them go, racing instead to where Beatrice had fallen. She was alive, just winded from her fall, her dress torn and dirt on her face. The 2 ranch hands who had been shot were also alive, just wounded, one in the shoulder and one in the leg. Quinlan dismounted and hauled Beatrice to her feet, his hands gripping her arms hard enough to bruise, his face inches from hers. "What were you thinking?" he demanded, his voice ragged with fear and anger. "You could have been killed." "I was thinking that I would not let them take what is yours," she said, her chin lifted in defiance even as she trembled. "I was thinking that I am tired of loss." He stared at her, this woman who had come to his ranch broken and desperate, who had quietly rebuilt herself into someone strong enough to stand against armed men. Without thinking, he pulled her against him, one hand cradling the back of her head, feeling her alive and solid in his arms. "I cannot lose you," he said into her hair, the admission torn from somewhere deep inside him. "I cannot lose anyone else." Beatrice's arms came up around him, holding tight. They stood like that for a long moment while around them the ranch hands emerged from cover and rushed to help the wounded men. When they finally pulled apart, Quinlan saw tears streaking through the dirt on Beatrice's face. "You are not going to lose me," she said fiercely. "I am not going anywhere." The wounded men were tended, the dead raider buried in an unmarked grave far from the ranch, and the sheriff from Hangtown rode out to take statements and assure them that the other raiders had been apprehended trying to cross into Nevada. Life returned to normal, or what passed for normal, but everything between Quinlan and Beatrice had changed. They no longer avoided each other. Quinlan took his meals at proper times, sitting at the head of the table and engaging in conversation. Beatrice began to smile occasionally, small expressions that transformed her face into something luminous. They talked in the evenings, sitting on the porch as the sun set, sharing stories of their lives before loss had marked them. "I wanted to be a teacher," Beatrice told him one night. "Before my parents died, I loved learning, loved the idea of helping children discover the world through books." "You still could," Quinlan said. "Hangtown needs a school teacher. The last one married and moved to Sacramento." She shook her head. "That was a dream from another life. I am a widow managing a ranch house now. It is enough." "It does not have to be," he said, looking at her. "You do not have to let loss define everything you become." "Is that what you are doing?" she asked gently. "Not letting loss define you." He was quiet for a long moment. "I am trying," he finally said. "Some days are harder than others." July arrived with heat that baked the valley and turned the grass golden. Quinlan and his hands worked from dawn until midday, rested during the worst of the afternoon heat, and resumed work in the evening. Beatrice adapted the household schedule, serving breakfast before sunrise and supper late. She took to sitting in the garden during the hot afternoons, reading the books Quinlan had bought her. Her hair loosened from its usual severe style. Quinlan found himself watching her more than he should, noticing the grace of her movements, the intelligence in her eyes, the way she listened when people spoke as if their words truly mattered. He felt guilty for noticing, as if acknowledging beauty in another woman somehow betrayed Sarah's memory. But Sarah was gone, and Beatrice was here, alive and present and slowly becoming necessary to him in ways that had nothing to do with household management. One evening in early August, he found her in the garden after supper, her hair down around her shoulders, a book forgotten in her lap. She was crying silently, tears streaming down her face, and when she saw him, she did not try to hide them. "I am sorry," she said, wiping at her eyes. "I thought I was past this." "Past what?" He sat down beside her on the garden bench they had built together the previous week. "Past feeling like I wasted a year of my life in a marriage where I was grateful but not happy. Past feeling guilty for being alive when Thomas is dead. Past wondering if I will ever feel anything real again." She looked at him, her amber eyes swimming with tears. "You loved your wife, truly loved her. I see it in everything you do, every memory you share. I envy that, even as I grieve for your loss. Does that make me a terrible person?" "No," Quinlan said, and took her hand before he could think better of it. "It makes you honest. Thomas gave you safety when you needed it, and that is worth something, but safety is not love. You should not feel guilty for knowing the difference." "Were you happy," she asked, "in your marriage?" "Yes," he said simply. "Sarah was easy to love. She was kind and patient and saw the best in everyone. But she is gone, and I am still here, and somewhere in the last few months, I have realized that being alive means more than just surviving." Beatrice's fingers tightened around his. "What does it mean?" "I do not know yet," he admitted. "But I think I would like to find out, with you, if you would want that." She drew in a shaky breath, and for a moment he thought he had miscalculated badly, that he had mistaken her grief and loneliness for something more. But then she leaned toward him, her free hand coming up to touch his face, and he understood. He kissed her carefully, aware of how fragile this moment was, how easily it could shatter. She tasted of salt from her tears and something sweet she had been drinking. Her lips were soft, her response tentative at first, then growing more certain. When they broke apart, they were both breathing hard, foreheads resting together. "I am afraid," Beatrice whispered. "I am afraid this is wrong, that it is too soon, that I am betraying Thomas even though I did not love him the way I should have." "I am afraid too," Quinlan said. "I am afraid I am betraying Sarah, even though I know she would want me to be happy. I am afraid that if I love you, I will lose you too, because that is what winter taught me." "But it is summer now," Beatrice said, pulling back to look at him. "And we are both still alive. Does that not count for something?" "It counts for everything," he said, and kissed her again. They took it slowly after that, learning each other with the caution of people who had already lost too much. Quinlan courted Beatrice the way he had once courted Sarah, but differently, because Beatrice was not Sarah, and he was no longer the man he had been. He brought her wildflowers from the high pastures, surprised her with a new dress in dark blue that she could wear now that a year had nearly passed since Thomas's death. They rode together in the evenings, exploring the boundaries of the ranch, talking about everything and nothing. Beatrice began to laugh again, a sound that started tentatively and grew more confident. She taught Quinlan to dance one evening in the parlor, humming a waltz she remembered from before her parents died, their feet moving across the floor Sarah had insisted on refinishing. He was clumsy and she was patient, and by the end they were both laughing, collapsed together on the sofa, her head on his shoulder. "I never danced with Thomas," she said quietly. "He said he was too old for such foolishness." "Dancing is never foolish," Quinlan replied, pressing a kiss to her hair. "Sarah taught me that. She said dancing was like praying with your whole body, celebrating life even when life was hard. She sounds like she was a wise woman, she was, and she would have liked you." He tipped Beatrice's chin up so he could see her face. "I need you to know that I love you not because you remind me of her, but because you are entirely yourself. You are strong and smart and braver than you give yourself credit for. You make me want to do more than just survive." Beatrice's eyes filled with tears, but they were not sad tears. "I love you too," she said. "I did not think I was capable of feeling this way, but you have proven me wrong. You have given me a home and a purpose, and now you are giving me your heart. I will not waste any of it." "I know you will not," he said, and kissed her until they were both breathless. August faded into September, the heat breaking, the air taking on the golden quality of early autumn. Quinlan proposed to Beatrice on a Sunday morning as they rode out to check on the cattle in the eastern pasture. He had no ring, just words and an open heart, and she said yes immediately, her smile brighter than the sun rising over the Sierra Nevada. They were married in October, a year after they had lost their respective spouses, in the small church in Hangtown with most of the town in attendance. Beatrice wore the blue dress Quinlan had bought her, and he wore his best suit, and they exchanged vows that spoke of second chances and new beginnings. The preacher who had buried Sarah and Thomas a year earlier now joined Quinlan and Beatrice together, and if there were those who thought it too soon or inappropriate, they kept their opinions to themselves. The ranch hands threw rice as Quinlan and Beatrice left the church, and there was a celebration at the ranch that lasted into the evening. Someone played a fiddle, and there was dancing and food and laughter, all the things that marked joy in a hard land. Quinlan danced with his new wife under the stars, the same stars that had watched him bury his first wife, and felt something in his chest that had been frozen for a year finally thaw completely. "Are you happy?" Beatrice asked as they moved together to music that drifted from the yard. "I am," Quinlan said, and realized it was true. "Are you?" "More than I ever thought possible," she replied, then added quietly, "I think Thomas would be glad I found this. He wanted me to be happy even if he could not give me that kind of happiness himself." "Sarah would be glad too," Quinlan said. "She always said life was for the living, that we honor the dead by living well, not by drowning in grief." "Then let us live well," Beatrice said and kissed him. That night, they moved Quinlan's things into the bedroom he had shared with Sarah, the room he had avoided for a year. Beatrice had changed the curtains and rearranged the furniture while he was in town the previous week, making it different enough that it no longer felt like a shrine to the past. They made love with tenderness and passion, discovering each other fully for the first time, and afterward lay tangled together in the darkness, speaking in whispers about the future they would build. "I want children," Beatrice said, her head pillowed on Quinlan's chest. "Is that all right to say?" "Is it too soon?" "It is not too soon," he replied, his hand stroking her hair. "I want that too. Sarah wanted it and I made her wait. I will not make that mistake again." "I want to teach them," Beatrice continued, "to read and write and think. I want them to grow up knowing they are loved and wanted, and that the world is full of possibilities." "They will know," Quinlan promised. "We will make sure of it." Winter came again, but this time it found Quinlan prepared. The ranch was in good order, supplies laid in, the cattle in prime condition. More importantly, he was not alone. Beatrice moved through the house bringing warmth and light, her laughter echoing in rooms that had been silent too long. She read to him in the evenings by the fire, complex novels and poetry that he would never have chosen himself, but found he enjoyed when filtered through her voice. Snow fell in December, heavy and thick, blanketing the ranch in white. Quinlan stood at the window one morning, watching it accumulate, and felt Beatrice come up behind him, her arms sliding around his waist. "Are you all right?" she asked softly. "I was just thinking about last winter," he admitted, "about how much has changed. A year ago I was burying Sarah and thinking my life was over. Now I am standing here with you, and I realize my life was not over, just different than I had planned." "Do you ever regret it?" Beatrice asked. "Choosing me?" He turned in her arms, cupping her face in his hands. "Never," he said firmly. "You are not a replacement for what I lost. You are something entirely new, something I did not know I needed. I loved Sarah, and I will always love her memory. But I love you too, differently but no less deeply. Both things can be true." "Both things can be true," Beatrice repeated, as if testing the words. "I am learning that. I can be grateful to Thomas for saving me and also grateful to you for showing me what love can be. The heart is larger than I thought." Christmas came, and they celebrated quietly, just the two of them and the ranch hands invited in for a special meal. Beatrice had made pies and roasted a goose, and there was music and stories, and a sense of family that transcended blood. Quinlan gave Beatrice a locket containing a small photograph of them taken in Hangtown, and she gave him a new pocket watch engraved with their initials and wedding date. "To mark time going forward," she said as he examined it. "Not backward." "Forward," he agreed, and pulled her into his lap, not caring that the ranch hands were watching with knowing grins. The winter was milder than the previous year, as if nature itself was offering an apology for past cruelty. Snow fell but did not trap them, and the cattle weathered it well. In February, on the anniversary of the day they had both stood in the cemetery burying their spouses, Quinlan and Beatrice rode to the graveyard together. They stood before the two markers, now weathered by a year of seasons, and paid their respects. "Thank you," Quinlan said quietly, speaking to Sarah's grave, "for teaching me how to love, for showing me how to live with purpose. I will not forget you, but I will not be trapped by grief either. I hope you understand." Beatrice placed flowers on Thomas's grave, her voice soft. "Thank you for giving me shelter when I needed it, for showing me kindness when I had nothing. I am sorry I could not give you the love you deserved, but I promise I will not waste the second chance I have been given. Rest well, Thomas." They stood together in the cold February sun, holding hands, honoring the past while choosing the future. When they rode back to the ranch, it felt like a weight had been lifted, like they had been given permission they had not known they needed. Spring returned in March, right on schedule, the earth waking from winter's sleep. The grass greened, flowers bloomed, and the cattle grew fat on rich pasture. In April, Beatrice confirmed what she had suspected for several weeks. She was pregnant. Quinlan received the news with joy so fierce it frightened him, sweeping her into his arms and spinning her around until she laughingly begged him to stop. "Careful," she said, though her eyes were shining. "You will shake the baby loose." "That is not how it works," he replied, but he set her down gently anyway, his hands moving to rest on her still flat stomach. "When?" "October, the doctor thinks. A year after our wedding." "Perfect timing," Quinlan said, though privately he was already worrying about all the things that could go wrong, all the ways he could lose her and the child both. Beatrice seemed to sense his thoughts because she took his face in her hands and made him look at her. "I am strong," she said firmly. "And you are not going to lose me. We have been given this gift and we are going to embrace it without fear. Can you do that? I can try, he said, and meant it. Beatrice's pregnancy progressed smoothly through the spring and summer. She continued managing the household until late August, when Quinlan finally insisted she rest more. He hired a girl from town to help with the heavy work, and Beatrice spent her days reading, sewing tiny clothes, and preparing for the baby's arrival. She bloomed with pregnancy, her face taking on a glow that had nothing to do with exertion and everything to do with happiness. Quinlan found himself simultaneously excited and terrified. He read every book about childbirth he could find, consulted with the doctor in Hangtown more times than was probably necessary, and ensured that everything was prepared. The bedroom was set up with supplies, the doctor was on call, and a midwife from town had agreed to stay at the ranch for the last month of Beatrice's pregnancy. "You are worrying yourself sick," Beatrice told him one evening in September as they sat together in the parlor. "Women have been having babies since the beginning of time. I will be fine." "Sarah wanted children," Quinlan said quietly, voicing the fear that had been haunting him. "What if this is somehow wrong? What if I am not meant to have this happiness? Quinlan Drake, you listen to me." Beatrice's voice was sharp enough to cut through his spiraling thoughts. "Sarah is gone, and that is a tragedy. But you are alive, and I am alive, and this baby is coming whether you are afraid or not. You can choose to spend the next month drowning in guilt and fear, or you can choose to be present for this joy we have created together. Which will it be?" He stared at her. This woman who had been so uncertain a year ago, who had transformed herself into someone fierce and unshakable. "You are right," he said finally. "I choose joy. I choose to be present. I choose you and this baby and the life we are building." "Good," she said, softening, "because I need you whole and focused, not lost in what-ifs and guilt." The baby came on a cool October evening, arriving with remarkable efficiency considering it was Beatrice's first child. Quinlan paced outside the bedroom door while the midwife and doctor worked, listening to Beatrice's labored breathing and trying not to imagine all the horrible possibilities. The ranch hands kept him company, brewing strong coffee and telling stories to distract him, but nothing could calm the fear that threatened to choke him. Then he heard it, the thin wail of a newborn, and his knees nearly buckled with relief. The midwife opened the door minutes later, smiling broadly. "You have a healthy son, Mr. Drake, and your wife is doing wonderfully. Come meet your boy." Quinlan entered the bedroom on shaking legs and found Beatrice propped up in bed, sweaty and exhausted and more beautiful than he had ever seen her. In her arms was a tiny red-faced creature wrapped in a blanket, wailing lustily at the unfairness of being born. "Our son," Beatrice said, her voice hoarse but triumphant. "We made him, Quinlan. We made this perfect little person." Quinlan sat carefully on the edge of the bed and looked at the baby. He had Sarah's dark hair and what looked like it would be Beatrice's amber eyes. He was small and wrinkled and absolutely perfect. "What should we name him?" Quinlan asked, his voice catching. "I thought James," Beatrice said. "James Quinlan Drake. James for my father, Quinlan for you. What do you think?" "I think it is perfect," Quinlan said, and carefully took his son from Beatrice's arms. The baby quieted immediately, staring up at him with unfocused eyes, one tiny hand escaping the blanket to wave aimlessly. Quinlan felt something crack open in his chest, a flood of love so intense it nearly hurt. "Hello, James," he whispered. "Welcome to the world. I am your father, and I promise I will do everything in my power to give you a good life." The baby yawned, unimpressed by the promises, and Beatrice laughed softly. "I think he is more interested in eating than your speeches." "Then you should feed him," Quinlan said, handing James back carefully. He watched as Beatrice began to nurse their son, the two of them figuring it out together with the midwife's guidance, and felt a peace settle over him that he had not experienced since before Sarah's death. This was what moving forward looked like. Not forgetting the past, but building something new on the foundation of what had been lost. The winter of 1875 was gentle, as if the world had learned its lesson about cruelty. James thrived, growing plump and happy, his cries filling the house at odd hours and somehow making everything feel more alive. Quinlan discovered that he was surprisingly good with babies, able to soothe James when Beatrice was exhausted, changing diapers without complaint, walking the floor at midnight while singing songs his own mother had taught him years ago. "You are a natural father," Beatrice told him one night as she watched him rock James to sleep. "Did Sarah know that about you?" "I do not know," Quinlan admitted. "We never had the chance to find out. But I like to think she would be happy to see this, to know that I got this chance even if she did not." "I think she would be," Beatrice agreed. "And I think Thomas would be happy to know I found real love, even if it was not with him. We are honoring them by living well, just as we promised." Spring came again, bringing with it new calves and fresh grass and the endless cycle of ranch life. James began to smile and then to laugh, a sound that brought joy to everyone who heard it. The ranch hands doted on him shamelessly, taking turns holding him and making ridiculous faces to earn his giggles. Quinlan expanded the herd and hired 2 more permanent hands, making the Drake Ranch one of the most prosperous in the valley. One evening in May, as they sat on the porch watching the sun set while James dozed in Beatrice's arms, Quinlan spoke the thought that had been forming in his mind for months. "I want more children with you, as many as you are willing to have. Is that selfish of me?" "It is not selfish," Beatrice replied, leaning against his shoulder. "I want that too. I want this house full of noise and chaos and love. I want James to have brothers and sisters. I want to build the family neither of us had a chance to build before." "Then we will," Quinlan said simply. "We will fill this ranch with children and teach them everything we know and watch them grow into good people. We will give them the happiness we found even in the shadow of loss." "We found spring together," Beatrice said softly. "That is what we can tell them when they are old enough to understand. We lost people we loved, but we did not let loss destroy us. We found each other and chose to build something beautiful from grief." "Yes," Quinlan agreed, kissing the top of her head. "That is exactly what we will tell them." Time moved forward as it always did, marked by seasons and milestones. James took his first steps in October, just before his first birthday, toddling across the parlor into Quinlan's waiting arms. Beatrice became pregnant again in the spring of 1876, and their daughter arrived that December, a tiny girl with Beatrice's honey hair and Quinlan's serious eyes. They named her Sarah, after the woman whose loss had brought them together, and Quinlan held her with tears streaming down his face. "Is this all right?" Beatrice asked anxiously. "Naming her Sarah. I should have asked you first." "It is more than all right," Quinlan managed. "It is perfect. Sarah would be honored, and our daughter will know she is named after someone brave and kind who taught her father how to love." The ranch continued to prosper. Quinlan bought more land, expanded into horse breeding alongside cattle ranching, and became known throughout the valley as a fair employer and honest businessman. Beatrice fulfilled her old dream of teaching by establishing a small school on the ranch for their children and those of the hands, bringing in books and supplies, and creating a place of learning that drew students from neighboring ranches as well. More children came, spaced 2 years apart, until the Drake household included James Sarah Thomas, named for Beatrice's late husband in an act of grace that Quinlan supported fully. Matthew, and finally little Catherine, born in 1884 when Beatrice was 33 and Quinlan was 38. The house was indeed filled with noise and chaos and love, just as they had planned, and somehow they made it work. Quinlan watched his children grow with a wonder that never faded. James was serious and studious, likely to take over the ranch someday. Sarah was wild and fearless, riding before she could properly walk, always covered in dirt and scrapes. Thomas was gentle and artistic, spending hours drawing the horses and landscapes around him. Matthew was the charmer, able to talk his way out of any trouble, while Catherine was too young yet to show her full personality, but seemed determined to keep up with her older siblings regardless of the obstacles. On quiet evenings, when the children were finally asleep and the house was peaceful, Quinlan and Beatrice would sit together on the porch as they had so many times before, watching the stars and reflecting on the life they had built. "You ever think about that winter?" Beatrice asked one such evening in 1885. They had been married 11 years, had survived loss and grief and emerged stronger on the other side. "I do," Quinlan admitted, "but not with the same pain I once felt. I think about Sarah and how much I loved her, and I am grateful for the time we had. I think about how that loss led me to you, and I cannot regret that even though I wish Sarah had lived. Both things exist together in my heart." "I think about Thomas the same way," Beatrice said. "He saved me when I needed saving, and that matters. But you showed me what love could be, and that matters more. We have built something remarkable from the ashes of that terrible winter." "We have," Quinlan agreed, pulling her closer. "5 children, a thriving ranch, a school, a community. We have honored the dead by living fully, just as we promised we would." "Do you think they would be proud of us?" Beatrice asked. "I know they would be," Quinlan said with certainty. "We took the worst thing that could happen and chose not to let it defeat us. We found each other in the darkness and brought each other into the light. That is not a small thing." The years continued their march. The children grew, the ranch evolved with the changing times, and Quinlan and Beatrice aged together with grace. They celebrated their 20th anniversary in 1895. Surrounded by their children and grandchildren, James had married and given them 2 grandsons already. The house was even more chaotic than before, and Quinlan loved every moment of it. On their anniversary, he presented Beatrice with a leather-bound journal he had been writing in secret for years. "I have been recording our story," he told her. "Everything from that first terrible winter to this moment. I want our children and grandchildren to know how we found each other, how we chose love over grief, how we built this family from loss and hope." Beatrice opened the journal with shaking hands, reading the first few entries, her eyes filling with tears. "This is beautiful," she whispered. "Thank you for remembering it all, the hard parts and the good parts both." "It is all worth remembering," Quinlan said. "Every moment, good and bad, led us here. I would not change any of it, even the pain, because it gave me you and this life we have built together." As they stood together on the porch of the ranch house, surrounded by family and love, Quinlan thought back to that frozen cemetery where they had first stood across from each other. 2 broken people bound by shared grief. They had both lost their spouses the same winter, had both thought their lives were over. Instead, they had found spring together, had found healing and hope and a love deeper than either had imagined possible. The cowboy and the widow had survived winter's cruelty and emerged into warmth. They had honored the dead by choosing life. They had built a family, a legacy, a love story that would be told for generations. And standing there under the stars with Beatrice in his arms, their children and grandchildren laughing in the house behind them, Quinlan knew with absolute certainty that Sarah would have been proud of the man he had become. just as Thomas would have been proud of the woman Beatrice had become. They had not forgotten their first loves. They had simply made room in their hearts for more love, more joy, more life. And that, Quinlan thought, was the greatest gift winter had given them, the knowledge that spring always returns, that life continues, and that the human heart is capable of healing even the deepest wounds if given time and tenderness, and a reason to hope. The ranch continued to thrive for decades. Quinlan and Beatrice grew old together, their love deepening with each passing year. They watched their children become adults, their grandchildren grow, and eventually welcomed great-grandchildren into the world. The Drake Ranch became legendary in the valley, known not just for its prosperity but for the family that had built it, a family born from loss and transformed by love. When Quinlan Drake died peacefully in his sleep at the age of 72 in 1918, he was surrounded by 4 generations of family, his hand held by Beatrice, who had been at his side for 43 years. His last words were of gratitude for the life he had been given, for the woman who had saved him from drowning in grief, for the children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren who filled the world with noise and love. Beatrice lived another 6 years, remaining sharp and engaged until the end. She continued teaching, writing letters to families scattered across the growing country, telling the story of how she and Quinlan had found each other in winter's darkest moment and built a spring that lasted decades. When she died in 1924 at the age of 73, she was laid to rest beside Quinlan in the Hangtown cemetery, not far from the graves of Sarah Drake and Thomas Jensen. The family placed a single stone marker for Quinlan and Beatrice, inscribed with simple words, "The cowboy and the widow who found spring together." Below that was a line from one of Beatrice's favorite poems, "Love is not diminished by honoring the past while embracing the future." Sarah and Thomas had markers of their own, maintained by the Drake family for generations, honored as the people who had given Quinlan and Beatrice the capacity to love deeply, even in the face of loss. The 4 graves existed together in the small cemetery, a testament to the complicated truth that love can take many forms, that grief does not have to be the end of the story, and that winter always, eventually, gives way to spring. The Drake Ranch remained in the family, passed down through James and his descendants, each generation learning the story of how it all began with 2 people who had lost everything and found each other. They learned about resilience and hope, about honoring the past while building the future, about choosing life even when death seemed to have won. And in the spring, when the snow melted and the grass turned green and the whole valley came alive with new growth, the Drake family would gather at the cemetery to place flowers on all 4 graves, Sarah and Thomas, Quinlan and Beatrice, remembering that loss and love are not opposites but partners in the complex dance of human existence, and that the greatest act of defiance against winter's cruelty is to choose spring regardless of the cost. The story of the cowboy and the widow became legend in Hangtown and beyond, told and retold until it took on the quality of myth. But at its heart, it remained a simple truth. 2 people who had every reason to give up on love chose instead to risk their battered hearts one more time, and in doing so, created something beautiful that lasted far beyond their own lifetimes. The ranch house still stood at the end of the 20th century, carefully preserved by descendants who understood its significance. The cabin where Beatrice had first lived was maintained as a memorial, and visitors could walk through the rooms where grief had transformed into hope, where 2 broken people had slowly become whole again. In the parlor, where Quinlan and Beatrice had danced that first time, where they had raised 5 children and welcomed countless grandchildren, There hung a portrait of them taken on their 30th wedding anniversary. They were both older in the image, their faces lined with experience, but their eyes shone with unmistakable love and contentment. Beneath the portrait was a plaque with Beatrice's words, "We found each other in winter and chose spring together." And every year, on the anniversary of that terrible blizzard that had taken Sarah and Thomas, the Drake family gathered not to mourn, but to celebrate. They celebrated the lives that had been lost and the lives that had been gained, the love that had been ended and the love that had been begun, the winter that had tested them and the spring that had vindicated their choice to continue living. Because that, in the end, was the true legacy of Quinlan Drake and Beatrice Jensen Drake. Not the ranch they had built or the children they had raised, though those mattered. Their legacy was the choice they had made again and again, day after day, to honor loss without being destroyed by it, to acknowledge grief without surrendering to it, to find love in the aftermath of tragedy and build something lasting from the fragments of broken hearts. The cowboy and the widow had lost everything the same winter, but they had found each other, and in doing so, had found spring. And that spring had lasted not just one season but generations, echoing forward through time as a reminder that winter, no matter how cruel or long, always ends, and that those brave enough to wait for warmth will be rewarded with growth and renewal and the chance to begin again. Their story was told around dinner tables and campfires, passed down from parents to children, adapted into songs and poems and eventually books. But the true story lived on in the lives of their descendants, in the way they loved fully despite knowing loss was inevitable, in the way they built families and communities and lives of meaning, in the way they chose hope over despair, joy over grief, spring over winter. Quinlan and Beatrice Drake had proven that the human heart is more resilient than it appears, that love can bloom in the most unlikely circumstances, and that even the darkest winter cannot prevent spring from returning if you are patient enough to wait for it and brave enough to recognize it when it arrives. And so their story ended not with death but with legacy, not with loss but with love, not with winter but with endless, eternal spring.